I am Tracy Armstrong. I'm CEO of Copyright Clearance Center. And this is a very important moment in the hype cycle of AI. If you were here for the last presentation, you heard so much about the what's happening in the innovation and research associated with AI. We can see evidence, I think all of the presentations here today and the conversations here at the book fair are evidence of how much things have evolved in just 1 year. There are very important implications where AI, copyright, and licensing intersect, and to foster a future that is both pro-copyright and pro-AI, it is essential to navigate this intersection. And today, this is what our panel will explore. So I'd like to introduce to you our panelists, starting with Sarah Teagan, here on my right, the Senior Vice President and Chief Publishing Officer of ACS Publications at the American Chemical Society. In addition, Sarah serves as chair of the STM Association of Scientific, Technical, and Medical Publishers. And to her right is Arendt Kusta, with 30 years of publishing experience, currently working as the Managing Director of CSIRO Publishing, which is Australia's National Science Agency's publishing arm. And to his right, Louis Simpson, the Executive Vice President of Global Policy for the Association of American Publishers, where she directs the association's engagement with the US government and foreign governments on copyright technology, competition, and international trade policy. And finally, Josh Jarrett, Senior Vice President and General Manager of AI Growth at John Wiley. He leads AI growth opportunities in content licensing, AI application development, and new business models. Now, please join me in welcoming our panelists. Very good. Well, we have a lot to discuss today, and I think who hasn't been talking about AI at every moment of this important book fair. So let's start off with what's top of mind right now. What's keeping you up at night, or getting you up in the morning, as it might be, when it comes to AI, LLMs, and copyright? Anybody want to start us off with what's keeping you up at night? Arendt, maybe, I don't know. Do you have a nightmare?
Yes, I mean, we are mostly an academic publisher, and sometimes we are just blind because we just look at the upstream side of AI. I happen to inherit a popular science magazine in Australia, and my colleagues started to using a RAG model to create small explainers about that, so that's all fine. But what happened was that the previous owners of that magazine weren't quite clear on how the copyright was handled. And journalists not only are scared of that, and rightly so, and it's part of the work, but they also have a platform to talk about it. So I made The Guardian, and I made the ABC because we weren't allowed to use freelancer content in that way. And the freelancers are absolutely right. But suddenly you become responsible for something you didn't want to do and you didn't really like doing, but suddenly you had to do it because as academic publishers, we are worried about this stuff coming to us and making sure it doesn't come from paper mills. So we are kind of blindsided on one side. So it's really, really important that whatever we do, we make sure we actually have the rights to use LLMs and actually license stuff away, and that's a scary story. We have got a bunch of lawyers working on that now, and I hope I can share some stories about that or make it more public, but I mean, you can Google.
We can look you up in The Guardian.
Yeah, you can. Not my name, thankfully. Although my LinkedIn suddenly spiked on a Friday afternoon on a cold winter's day in Melbourne, which wasn't good. But it is just really important. And that's why the initiatives by CCC are so important for us to be part of, because you make sure you have something which you can license away. So that kept me up a couple of nights, but I mean, most of the time I'm kept up by the worry about losing the trust of our clients and of our authors by publishing something which has been wrong, which probably everybody here shares.
Anyone else have something keeping them up at night?
I guess I'll take a turn. As a policy person and one based in the US, I think I should say that litigation keeps me up at night because, as you probably know, there are about 32 cases in the United States specifically about the question of AI and the intersection with the copyright. And if we get the decision wrong, or not we, but the courts, then that, of course, sets us back so many years in terms of the copyright field. So my hope is that while it might be clear to us that there is infringing occurring, that this training cannot occur without massive reproduction and reuse, that the courts actually do see that, and that there is no exception that applies fairly, and therefore they should make a decision that fairly compensates the works upon which training data sets are created. Because frankly, without your work, without the creative creations of authors and the investment by publishers in the dissemination of those works, you wouldn't even have generative AI because they wouldn't have the text upon which to have been trained. So that, Tracy, is part of the nightmare, but then there are so many other things in terms of what are we not seeing, right? In terms of other fields, not just copyright, privacy, data security, and all those other things that I think in a way it's the dystopian nightmare of what copyright might be without a proper framework, without proper guardrails.
So when we wake up in the morning, we want to see, for a sunny, happy morning, a proper framework, perhaps some licensing, as well as other policy frameworks to put the guardrails around this environment we find ourselves in today. Sarah, did you want to add to that?
I do. I think my fears, what keeps me up at night are a little bit different, right? So I'm also an academic publisher based in the U.S. Where our editors are all practicing scientists, which is great, right? So they know and deeply appreciate scholarship. I spend some time in the lab myself, so I also know and understand scholarship. And the things that I keep thinking about is scholarship continues to be based on the results of what has come previously, right? Build on others' work. And so when I think about large language models and the way and when content is trained, the thing that keeps me thinking is like, how often are these models updated? You know, how does that influence like what authoritative content looks like? How often are retractions noted in there? What happens with retractions in large language models? Because sometimes we get it wrong. And then the other thing that I'm starting to worry a lot more about too is if people are using different large language models, different jurisdictions where access to content is different, the kinds of answers that are returned from things like ChatGPT are different. So now we have lots of different sources of potential truth. And how do you wade through what's really going on? And I don't know how to do that, but it's certainly getting my hair grayer and giving me some more wrinkles, I think.
A lot of reason for wrinkles there. Josh.
Yeah, a couple of things that keep me up at night, but then something I think gets me out of bed in the morning, maybe a little optimistic. I think one keeps me up at night is speed matters, right? That the world is changing so fast, and if we want, as a community, want to shape the AI world, we have to act as opposed to be shaped by it. So, but at the same time, we worry about quality and integrity. We have to wait on legal decisions. It might be 12, 18 months till we know, and so we're in limbo. So how do we navigate speed in a world of uncertainty where we have high stakes, right? So that's one thing. I think another thing is there's no real single thing as AI rights. I mean, there's lots of different flavors, and so how do we sort through all that, different uses for different content, et cetera? But I think something that I come back to is I think that in the long run, the high quality, new ideas, trusted brands, and trusted sources will continue to be the coin of the realm, and in fact will be increasingly important. So how do we defend quality and truth and trust in this time of change? Because that will see us through if we can do that effectively.
Which is very tightly knitted in with what Sarah just talked about in terms of integrity and other matters as well. Let's take I sort of hear some themes about harmonization here. For example, I think, Sarah, you were saying we could be using different models in different parts of the world based on different data, be getting different results. We don't understand what that is. Let's talk a little bit about policy and harmonization, if we could, for a second. Louis, perhaps you could start off by giving us some idea of how publishers are working with policymakers globally to shape licensing frameworks or other frameworks that support innovation and intellectual property rights? Because we're hearing from Josh and our colleagues here, quality matters. And researchers have committed their entire careers to these outputs. So could you help us a little bit understand what's happening?
So of course, while the fundamentals of copyright should be the same all over the world, some things are jurisdictional. So all of you are probably represented by a particular national publishers association. So your engagement with them is critical because it is through us that we then engage with policymakers. And one of the critical things that we speak to with policymakers about is that the copyright framework is fundamental because, frankly, licensing does not happen without the copyrights upon which things are based, right? So copyright grants you, the publisher, the rights holder, the exclusive rights to control when, who, how, and to what purpose your copyrighted work is to be used. So our goal, our messaging to policymakers is do not think about or even attempt to implement unnecessary exceptions because all they do is essentially dilute the exclusive rights and frankly dilute the manner in which you can control your ability to do something with the work. So I suppose we meet a lot with policymakers. We talk about the importance of copyright. We talk about why exceptions are unnecessary because frankly licensing is the key. And licensing is flexible, licensing is necessary because it allows you, the rights holder, to control the destiny of the work, but it also sets quite clearly the ground rules, the responsibilities, the obligations between the parties. As sort of arm's length transactions, you, the rights holder, determine what purpose the work should be put to. So realizing that licensing is important because it does set compensation rules, for example. I think critical to that is also control. Again, your ability to tell the user what it can and cannot do with the work. In addition, if you look at a US market, for example, or other markets where there might be a similar fair use framework, the existence of a licensing market is critical to assessing sort of the fair use doctrine. There's a so-called fourth factor about market harm. So you as the publisher do have to show that when a LLM developer infringes on your work, they are in fact affecting adversely your market. And so you, unfortunately, it has become the case that you as a rights holder have to prove that a market exists, that you're actually utilizing that market, and even if it is emerging, it is one that is actually on the cusp, or even if it's not on the cusp, it is actually already there. It's unfortunate that you as a rights holder have to defend that, have to prove that, because at the end of the day, it is your right, and therefore, before they even engaged with your content, they should have asked your permission, and if they did use it, attributed to you, and frankly, paid fair compensation. So those are the critical talking points that we bring to policymakers so that they know. They all talk about balance, but frankly, balance is the copyright framework. And so if any exceptions are to be set, think very carefully about that because again, I think just as you said, law is very slow, but technology moves at an exponentially faster speed than we do as lawmakers, and sometimes we can't catch up. But I think let's hark back to the internet days where things came online like Napster, and there were a litany of lawsuits that came out. I think we're there, right? Everyone is suing everyone else, but at some point, there will be a decision. It may take a long time, but we will create frameworks that might work for all of us. It's just that we can't wait for that. And so I suppose, I don't want to get into that yet, but if you are thinking about licensing, I think the bottom line is don't just think about it, engage in that, because licensing will be key to your exerting control over your work.
Could be key to how some of these cases are determined also, as there's a look across the market to see, are there market-based solutions, are there market-based licenses out there in all jurisdictions? Arent, as a publisher within a government organization, how are you dealing with the AI challenge? And let me put another question on the back of that. What role do you feel that publishers should play in promoting research integrity regarding the use of LLMs and AI systems? We heard a very important comment on integrity. I want to pull that out a little bit.
Yeah, first of all, we also have to realize that our users are moving even faster than the technology companies, right? Because they're going to adapt to it, and we've got to be clear that I'm German, so I do everything here in my second language, okay? So if I write something, my gosh, I need every tool I can to write something, right? And whether that's a thesaurus, whether that's a spell checker, whether it's a ChatGPT thing to get me started on the tyranny of the blank page, I need everything to get going, and I use everything to get going. And I'm a user in that case, and so are our authors. And I think they're moving much, much faster. And what can we do as a small organization around that? We can do two things. We've got to continue to learn, continue to engage with the communities, continue engage. But I mean, publishing has become an arms race in many ways. We don't have the resources. Our resources have got to be to partner with the STM Association on the Research Integrity Hub, partner with CCC on licensing, because we cannot do it ourselves alone. We have to find ways to partner with people, to learn, to adapt, to look for opportunities, and to work with this. But on the other hand, this is one of the most fascinating moments in time. I mean, it's almost like, I remember in 1996, I went to a traditional German publisher and I wanted to license Franz Kafka. And they said, oh, our stuff will never be on the internet. Signed the license 2 years ago. Yes. It's a very, very similar moment of time, of experimentation, of trying not to be afraid, and not to be afraid to fail and talk about it, like I earlier did. I think that's kind of what we have to do.
Yeah, agree. Sarah, maybe you have some comments on integrity, and on the back of that, maybe talk a little bit about the kind of tools. Are the tools trained with the right information? What are the AI impacts that the content researchers are, and academic researchers are experiencing? So integrity and then the tools. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I follow the Nobel Prizes very carefully, right? So last week, 2 out of the 4 science prizes were awarded to artificial intelligence, or prizes dealing with artificial intelligence at different levels. And so one of those, right, the AlphaFold software that helps predict protein folding is speeding up research incredibly, right? Which is super exciting from a human health perspective, from a research perspective, from like there's great fundamental research that's going to come out of this, as well as translational research, which is really cool. But what's happening, like AlphaFold wasn't trained on a big, large language model that was, scraped across all of the internet. It was trained on content that is really well curated. It's stuff that came out of the Protein Data Bank and SwissProt and other things like that's really specialist kind of content. But with the amount of knowledge that was in, or the amount of information that was in those specialized databases, you'd predict the folding of every single protein that's unknown today. Like, how cool is that? So I think what that says to me, though, is that these broad language models are going to have a place, but it's going to be these specialized databases that are going to provide a lot more rich information. So I think there's going to be lots of RAGs that overlie the big models, or there's going to be smaller language models, I guess, that
Tracy,
do
can
interesting
I
things.
just interject on the integrity point? Because I think, Sarah,
Yes.
you mentioned the specialized models that are trained on highly curated, specialized, high-quality content. But if you look at the large language models that are foundational to these new or more refined models, unfortunately, many of them have in fact been trained on repositories that do contain pirated works. And on those pirate repositories, they don't care about retraction, correction, modification. So if your foundational model is trained on that and none of the risk mitigation corrections have been undertaken by the LLM developer, if you apply that to, say, a device that supposedly can diagnose disease, but you haven't used the version of record, just imagine the catastrophic cascading results of something that was trained on garbage data. I think, again, it's not just about financial, copyright, et cetera. There are real human life effects that this unregulated technology, if we allow it to continue on its trajectory without proper guardrails, is something that we really should be worried about.
We could think about defense. We could think about water systems. We could think about lots of things. And I think that's the point, Sarah, that, this is great work that's been done in this protein folding, for example, which gives you optimism for oncology and so many other disciplines. But there's a big delineation between the foundational models. Did you have more on that, or?
No, just really that I want to say that I agree completely with Louis here. The garbage in, garbage out, right? I worry too then about like the context in which results are presented. You know, does our highly curated, authoritative content get just like served up alongside stuff that comes from Reddit, right? And what does that do in terms of people's trust in science and the veracity and people's ability, you know, to think critically about the literature? I think it sort of can have the effect of dumbing us down in addition to potentially causing harm.
And we think science, and that's such sophisticated content, as well as very sophisticated news content. We could have misinformation about a drug, a vaccine, something, I don't know, something that's happening in the news that is just completely misinformation and misinforming people about, you know, disaster relief, natural disasters, things like that. Josh, I want to give you a chance if you have anything to say on ethics or on integrity. Any thoughts on this or the tools?
Yeah, I think this. I think pushing for transparency of what's in these models is pretty universally held belief. I was on Capitol Hill in the U.S. a couple weeks ago, meeting with Hill staffers, and there's very little in the U.S. that is bipartisan. You may have heard the news. Yes. That's not misinformation. And it turns out
you joined this panel for this breaking news.
Yeah, breaking news, right? But one of the things that there is a lot of alignment on is AI safety, AI ethics, AI transparency. What's the right approach? They're still trying to figure it out, and there's the pace of lawmaking. But this question of what is in these models, you see the EU AI Act has said you need to give reasonable clarity on what's in there. We still have to define what that is. But I think there's opportunity for us as a community to make it easier, right? How do we make that citation, make that really clear that this model has content that's been ethically trained or actually fairly compensated? It's the version of record. We should come up with the standards, and we should enforce that in any licensing contract. Say you will agree at least once a quarter or once a year. As we've engaged in licensing contract, it's a requirement. It says if we find that there's a change, you have to update, right? If there's a retraction, you have to update your data, and you're committing to do that, and the next training run has to have that updated data in it. So I think there's a set of actions we can take, and that we can build them into best practice, we can put them into contracts, and we can put them into standards. I think standards is another place that we can probably get started and make some progress. How do I cite the version of truth when I'm showing a result out of an LLM or an application so that the user understands the difference of that? Then it'll pop up a little Reddit logo if it's primarily based off of Reddit discussion boards.
But maybe just go to that. I mean, it's really all about transparency. But transparency works both ways. Transparency works for us to say, how are we using it? What standards are we using it? How are we working with the standards? But also transparency from our users, our authors, saying, yes, I used this tool to generate that, to deal with the tyranny of the white page or whatever they did. So I started working off that. We can't put the kind of genie back in the bottle and saying, oh, this didn't exist. Everybody starts using it. But it's important to be transparent how it's being used and what is done with it, and that is properly labeled in the standards.
Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I want to build a little bit on that. I think it's, yes, how they're using it, but why did those researchers choose to use an AI tool? It could just be the tyranny of the blank page, but was there something more fundamental about it? And I think that's really interesting too.
That goes to images as well. I mean, that, the famous rat image, which doesn't leave you once you've seen it.
Louis.
Well, since we are at a licensing panel, I just wanted to tie the transparency requirement to the licensing part. Because
exactly where I was just going to go.
Because they always complain that it's so difficult to license, it's so difficult to be transparent about the content we use. But if you think about it, licensing is actually an enabling technology. Because if you tracked from whom you licensed the content, what content was included in that training data set, you actually have the the basic elements of what a transparency requirement should look like. And to your point about a dual transparency requirement, it's not just the LLM developer disclosing what they used and how they used it, but if you yourself as a business have embedded a particular technology or LLM model into your businesses, we do have also a responsibility to disclose to a consumer, to the public, to the user, that they are in fact engaging with an AI or generative AI technology, because these things will have implications for employment, for housing, for financial decisions. And if you were denied a job because some AI said you were unqualified, the consumer needs, or at least deserves to know that, so that things can be addressed if they need to be. So licensing, I guess, in all things is and can be an enabling mechanism for accomplishing transparency, for promoting responsible and ethical AI development.
Well, we just, many of us would have received an email from LinkedIn in the last 36 hours or so, notifying all LinkedIn users that they will be training, using your LinkedIn data, training AI models, beginning, I believe, November 20th, and giving many users in many countries and jurisdictions a chance to opt out. They're not doing that in all jurisdictions. So in many European countries, they will not be using that data at this time, according to their statement. But I think that's an example of the type of transparency to the user that I think you were just talking about. And that's exactly where I was going, Louis, which is how does licensing fit into the paradigm of responsible AI? Josh, I want to go back to you for a second, because Wiley's been an early mover in AI licensing, and I think we've read quite a bit about that in the press, many of us. How did you arrive at where you are today? What were your decisions? Can you give us a little window into the world of Wiley and AI licensing?
Sure. If folks don't know, yeah, we've done a couple large deals, agreements to help develop foundational models. We're also working with healthcare companies or pharmaceutical companies thinking about their internal models and how they can figure out how data, first-party data, third-party data can accelerate drug discovery, et cetera. There's a lot of those active conversations, and it's worth thinking that there's not just one segment. There's my point around there's not just AI rights, right? There's different flavors. But it was, I think there were a couple of things that were true. One is early on, probably about a year ago, we looked at what was happening and we said it's happening anyway, right? We can't put our head in the sand, and that we're going to lean in and we're going to really try and spend executive time and commit to this and think about experimentation and think about learning. All right, so that by doing that we would learn faster, and we're not going to be perfect, right? We'll probably make mistakes. We'll share when we do that, as Anand said. But there's a lot of stakeholders. We're a 217-year-old company. Mm-hmm. We're still controlled by the Wiley family. My board chair is Jesse Wiley, the 7th generation of John Wiley. So how do we engage that group around, okay, are we betting the company? And so how do we think about that? So we spent a lot of time just talking through, but importantly, we created guardrails. We said, let's not assume this is a monolithic answer. Where do we feel comfortable, right? Do we feel comfortable with certain content because we feel very comfortable we have the rights? Okay, well, what is that content? Do we feel differently about older content that maybe isn't temporal, not recent? We might feel differently about that. And so we created a guardrail document with our board, and we said, okay, can we move at the pace of the market inside this guardrail? Anything outside of this, we'll come back and consult with you on. And that gave us a place of alignment. We'd have to solve all of the problems all at once, because it's sort of like that movie, Everywhere, Everything, All at Once. Like, that's really the AI story.
So you fenced around room to move.
Right. We said, okay, room to move. Now we don't have to wait for all the decision-making apparatus. We can move at the pace of the market. And in these other places we don't feel safe, we'll continue to use a broader apparatus and go slower. And that really helped, I think, unlock our early movement.
So we're talking about feeling safe in licensing. So Sarah and Arent, do you want to comment on when you're thinking about licensing, what are the considerations that a publisher should account for? What would make you more or less likely to license? Those sorts of aspects. And any comments at all on CCBY type of models that you might want to comment on? I'm just throwing that out in the main here.
I mean, first of all, we've got to remember that publishing is a deeply human interaction. And some of the guardrails, especially for smaller publishers like us, are actually our staff. because they read the articles and they work with the articles, and that's important to bear in mind. But when it comes to CC BY, the question comes always: is CC BY fit for purpose in an LLM world? And initially, if you would go out as a publisher and say, I'm going to adopt CC BY and CND, the open access evangelist will call us out and say, hang on, you're not true to the spirit of open access anymore. But it's our authors who are asking us for it. And we've got to remember that we are the agents of our authors in many ways. And they want to have a right to decide which license they use. And I think we really have to deeply rethink that CC BY is fair game and can be used for whatever. And maybe some authors don't really want us to do that. And
do you
we
think,
have to adapt
sorry to
to it.
interrupt, but in light of the massive changes in the market in AI, with AI, the explosion of it since late 2022 in the public sphere, we read about it every day, and hearing about it every day, do you think authors' views on that are changing, that they look at it a little bit differently now and want more options?
They absolutely are changing. I mean, I had the first time discussion on that in a different job, admittedly, a year ago in Israel when I got grilled, saying, "Oh, we don't like CC BY here, because of the LLMs." So the authors start to care. Some authors don't really care. I mean, not all authors are the same. But the one who care, they want to have an option. And I think as publishers, we need to start thinking, giving our authors options to decide how their content is used, where and when, for what. I think that's always been our role. And that's kind of where we have got to go back in many ways.
So that's an important part of the framework. Sarah, would you add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I've got a natural experiment that I can do, and all of a sudden I feel like an economist. But our default open access license at the American Chemical Society is CC BY and CND. And we've taken a lot of flack for that. Authors can opt for a CC BY license if they want, but I think the recent announcements from Wiley and others about the licensing of your content to some of these large language models gives me the opportunity to see if authors actually change their minds about what kind of license they want to apply to their open access content. And I just sort of came up with that idea here, but I think it's something that I'm going to go back and take a look at and see what happens over time, because I do think that authors care a lot about what happens with their content, what happens with the attribution of their content, because that's how they gain currency in their world, right? So I would not be surprised if we saw an increase in more NC&D licenses.
I mean, personally, I use Flickr for many years. Are my pictures there licensed on CC BY? No. And they're all licensed on an NC&D license or NC license. Because if somebody thinks this is worthwhile, I quite like to buy a new hard disk from it. I never made money on it. But, this is how authors think. As authors, you need to think, who is using your content? What do you want to allow? Maybe you want to allow it. Maybe you don't want to allow it. But you need to be in control. And I think being in control is the key element of that.
Can I add too?
Yes,
I think it's important to remember that licensing is a huge part of publishers' job for a very long time, and this is the next evolution. And so sometimes we sort of have this conversation like it's that we have to reinvent every framework and every tool, but I think we've got to build on the infrastructure, the agreements, and figure out how to, there are different considerations. There are special considerations to be thoughtful of that. But in many cases, the partnership between authors and publishers has included, we want to get our ideas out there and disseminate them. We trust you to use licensing as one of those tools in the toolkit. So how do we have to adapt that? But it's not a new concept. I think that's important to remember.
It's actually quite age-old. And Louis, if you could comment, if I could ask you, and please add your bit, but I would like to ask you, so we're hearing from you about these lawsuits in the US, right? And there will be more lawsuits, I'm sure, forthcoming. At the same time, as Josh was just mentioning, Wiley, for example, and many other publishers have been licensing. There is a more and more robust licensing market. I mean, in the time we've been on this panel, new licenses have been executed. So to say there aren't market-based solutions and licenses out there today is just simply false. There are more and more licenses every day that passes. So can you just help us navigate that, from a policy perspective? So we've got these companies, large language model, public commercial companies that are out there, big, rich companies that have taken a lot of content, trained massive models without a license in many, many cases. And we've got also in parallel an increasing amount of licensing happening. So we're sort of in this sort of, well, if we're in the US, for example, well, it's sort of a fair use out of one side of my mouth, but on the other side of my mouth, I'm signing licenses. So what's your perspective on that from, as an expert lawyer and working with policymakers, for all of us regular people in the crowd?
So I think, I suppose if you're a large language model developer, you did take without permission, without paying. And it's because they say it was difficult to license, it's difficult to contact all the appropriate rights holders. So why are they licensing now? It's because they've been sued. And so they're, frankly, CYA, right? Cover your ass. Because if we win, as fingers crossed we do as rights holders, then there will be damages, we hope, and the law will then demand that they pay what they owe. And of course, it doesn't solve our original sin problem of they took so much. How do we then begin accounting for how much they took and how much is owed? That's a whole other problem. But on the other side of should you be licensing, are you making a deal with the devil because they have already taken everything? And should you even engage with these companies? I think to Josh's point, you should, right? Because do not be afraid of the technology. And again, but not just about compensation. It is very much about control. Re-exert your control over the work. Determine how it should be used. Establish the guardrails you want. So in some cases, it's also just saying, yes, you can use it to train, but none of my work should be used to generate outputs that are competitive with the very works I publish. So those are sort of the two things. Bottom line, they're licensing with you because they're worried that things will turn out against them, which of course we in this room, I hope, are all thinking it better be. And on the other hand, let's license because that also protects us at the end of the day. And you will, in fact, get better content. Again, the garbage in, garbage out issue. You have to rely on curated, high-value content. And I'll just mention very briefly, think about the environmental impact. Because these companies that trained on dirty data, they're expending unnecessary resources in cleaning that data. But think about having sourced that content from a highly qualified publisher. You don't have to engage in that data cleansing exercise. You are actually saving yourself some money in that respect as well as an LLM developer.
Excellent. Let me touch on, we're getting close to wrapping up. I want to ask the audience if there are any questions in the audience. I welcome those. Let me just check right now and see, do we have any questions in the audience? It's hard for me to see with the lights. I do have one right up here, and I think I might need a mic for that. So I'm going to have a mic coming up here in just a second. I did want to toss out to the panel threats. I don't want to end on a down note, so we have a little bit of time before we end. What do we see as the biggest threats because of the AI bit? I'm hearing a lot of pro-copyright and pro-copyright and pro-licensing and pro-AI comments here. Is that where we're looking, or do we foresee any other threats if we don't get to licensing? Is that where we find the threats? If we don't get to that, really fully engaged licensing environment? Any comments on that?
I think that one threat I see is if we do fail to license, because then does the government come in and say there's a market failure, I will then begin setting the rate as to what you should be receiving and what the other side should be paying.
So we lose our choice then.
Exactly. And if you think about statutory licenses, they depress the value of your work because then they have to think about, well, how much is this party willing to pay? It's not the arm's length transaction of two reasonable parties coming to the table and agreeing, what am I willing to pay for your high value content and what am I, as the rights holder, willing to accept as that value. So we lose that if we fail to license. So I think we should think very carefully about why we should be licensing. So just to end, Tracy, I think let's go back to the theme, let licensing bloom. All sorts of licensing are welcome, so long as they are voluntary. So collective voluntary licensing, of course, very welcome, but also direct licensing, because again, it is the rights holder who should determine the when, the how, the who, and for what purpose.
Excellent. And let me go to the question, if you don't mind. Did we get, oh, I'm sorry, over here. Wait, you go ahead, you go, and then we bring the mic back over. Sorry about that, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Extremely interesting panel, and I can't agree more with everything that has been said. There is only one note. I think we are not talking about the rights of the final users. As a final user of AI, I think I have the right to know on which source the LLM has been trained, because it's very different if it has been trained on the content from Wiley or from New York Times, or if it has been trained on the content from neveronthemoon.com and flatearth.com, right? As a customer, I think we should have this right to check what's the source. Exactly like buying food and knowing which ingredients are inside of it. I'd like to have your point of view on that.
So we're really, I think the question really goes to the importance of transparency, which I think goes to integrity and so many of the topics that have been mentioned. Sarah, you want to start us off?
I guess I couldn't agree more with you. And I think that there's a role then for us publishers as we license content to put the terms in our licensing agreements that talk about transparency, that talk about how often are you updating your models, that talk about how do you more provide additional weight to content that comes from us than content that comes from flatearth.com, right? And then I think, too, one thing that we haven't talked about that we heard about at the STM meeting earlier this week was an environmental, legal, societal impact analysis. And if we can start putting stuff like that into our agreements that say, you know, LLM, tell me about what you're doing here, that gives us the ability to help the end user be more assured about what the results that are coming out of an LLM are.
We also have an ethics arm in there,
Yeah.
really. Yes, Josh.
Yeah, I want to add, I 100% agree, and I think these are all the push techniques we should be using. I have a couple crazy ideas that I'll share on pull techniques, right? How do we empower the users to demand that transparency? And you mentioned food, like the fair trade movement, right? The organic movement, right? What's the seal of approval that people demand that says, okay, were copyright holders fairly compensated? Does this have been vetted quality information? How can I trust that? What's the good housekeeping seal of approval that consumers should demand? How do we think about insurance companies, investors, venture capitalists? How do we share with them about the risk? And the insurance companies should be putting pressure to say, whoa, which AI models are you using? Are you using the ones that are going to expose me to downstream risk? Or are you using ones that were fairly traded? So I think there's some pull things that we ought to creatively look at too.
I'll just mention there is an entity called Fairly Trained that does seek to certify the LLMs that have actually been trained just on curated licensed data. And my CEO is actually an advisory member.
And that's a foundation started by Ed Newton-Rex, who I believe resigned from Stability AI in protest over their misuse of copyrighted materials. So that's definitely worth looking into.
And maybe we shouldn't also forget that the machine cannot take ownership. So if I drive a Tesla and I run somebody over on autopilot, I still am liable. So the machine can't take liability if something goes wrong. And I think, especially in scholarly publishing, that is absolutely crucial to bear in mind, because we are advancing knowledge as much as we can use AI in peer review. We shouldn't use it just for peer review, because science is all about the new, and only the new things and new thoughts will be revolutionary and wouldn't come out if we would rely on the machine of doing them. But at the same time, the machine can't take ownership, and that's why labeling both ways is so important.
One last point is that I thought where you're going was that machine-generated content can't be copyrighted, at least in the U.S. And so, right, so content that I should let the lawyer talk about it.
Almost anywhere, just to be clear. Yes.
Right, of course.
Well, entirely AI-generated content cannot be, so. Yeah.
Right, so
And
what's the human
not
threshold?
Not just in the U.S., to be
Right.
clear. Almost anywhere, sorry. A lot of copyright complexity there, Josh. Sorry, we're all jumping on poor Josh. And Arent, you're giving us all the nightmares. Now we're having car accidents, okay? So we've gone from, you're in the
But I
Guardian,
live in
now you're having a
Australia,
car
everything
accident.
comes out to kill you.
Oh my gosh. I don't know how I'm moderating this panel. Sarah, did you have more, or can I go to the next question? Okay, right up here, sir, in the front row.
So in transparency, I work for Josh on the AI growth team. I want to thank you for the panel. I had a question for Sarah. You mentioned that authors might be rethinking their CC BY and CD licenses and to exert more control over where their rights are licensed. In our experience working at Wiley, we've seen a lot of fear, anxiety. All of the bad news about AI comes before any of the good news about AI. You know, the discussion around AlphaFold doesn't even make it in until the bias question is answered or until the garbage in, garbage out questions are answered. And I'm wondering, as publishers, as policymakers, what can we do? Aren, you mentioned that we're reliant on authors, on editors, on researchers, on scientists, right, to provide and generate these new ideas and new concepts. What is our responsibility to educate, inform, to bring our constituents, our stakeholders, our partners in publishing forward so that they make educated decisions about whether or not they want to change their license and to renegotiate their rights, right? I think the easiest thing to do is to opt out in many cases. And we're trying to understand what are those anxieties, and as a publisher, as a policymaker, what can we do to provide reassurance, compensation, right? Rights, ethics, guardrails, all of these things. How do we bring that to the broader audience, many of whom are writing their first article, who have never engaged with a publisher, right? Who are subject matter experts in one field and don't know a whole lot about the rest of the world. You might have met these people. So I'm just wondering, what is our position there? How do we bring that knowledge forward, and how do we make sure that people can make an educated decision about participating or not participating in those areas?
Well, I think your word educate is educated decision is the right one, right? So what can we as publishers do to provide those educational materials, those flowcharts, those tools to help our authors understand precisely what's going on, right? So we do some author education. How do you write a paper? How do you review a paper? How do you whatever kinds of things, right? Those are really well received, but that's kind of publishing, 101. This is kind of a 301 kind of topic, right? But I don't think that means we should shy away from it. And so, sure, we as individual publishers can all do stuff like that, but it's also an opportunity for our trade associations to be able to provide some really excellent material to help educate the entire community.
It's an important role for the associations. Let's just see in the audience here. Let's see a show of hands. Should rights holders be licensing today? Who thinks rights holders should be licensing today for AI uses? Who's not sure? And who thinks, no, we should not be licensing today for AI uses? Okay, we have unanimity. Everybody thinks we should be licensing. Our job is done, my panel friends. So I just want to, does anybody have a comment that they wanted to?
I think there was a question over there. I could see
sorry.
a half-hearted hand going
Okay.
on.
Is there a question? I'm so sorry, it's behind me.
I'll take it. Is it? Okay, thank you. I've heard a few people say this is just a moment in time, this moment of licensing, maybe next couple of years, then the machines will move on, and that this is their own sort of, I've heard one or two publishers say that. What's your view about whether this is an ongoing, sustainable marketplace that's opening up, and the demand, the ongoing demand for high-quality data?
Sure, I can start on that. I think it's a great question and one we wrestle with a lot. I think there is a moment in time, and I think sometimes I talk about the good old days of AI licensing, meaning August, because it's changing that fast. I mean, in terms of hey, we need every word we can find because we want to put a bunch of words in here. And that was all the messy words. And that taught us a lot about language. But now we actually need to learn about particular disciplines. We learn about reasoning. We need to learn more about coding. We need to learn about multimodal images and text and voice and video. We need to learn about multiple languages, right? So we're really to the stage now where we are thinking about, okay, how do we get smarter in particular areas? And so that's creating different demand, but it's creating demand for smaller sets of higher quality content. But I think this question of sustainability is a really important one. That was one of the things when you think about threats and what keeps me up at night is, does this all just go away in 12 months? And how do we create a sustainable relationship, a partnership, where these models need to be kept current? They need to be evaluated. They need to be benchmarked for the most recent information. And I think that's one of our big goals, is how to establish a dialogue, understand the needs, and to create an ongoing relationship. And new content right? Obviously, academic research is always evolving, and that creates an ongoing relationship. Different types of content has everything. That's why you see all this OpenAI spending so much money on news content, because that is fresh every morning.
I do think it's not a moment in time, frankly, because the way these models are trained, they will be required to retrain in certain instances because adapt to the time. So you might have heard of RAG licenses. Again, anything trained or anything that came out in 2020 was trained on everything before 2020. So if you asked a machine that was then developed at that time, it will give you garbage because it hasn't learned anything from 2020 onwards. So retrieval augmented generation is a thing, and there will be licenses for that. And there are also different stages of training. Training, inference training, and then model training or retraining. So there are various stages in that training cycle that I think you will have markets. But as Josh said, it also varies by language, by the type of model, and for the use.
And also maybe by the use, if I could throw in, sorry, Arent, is just to say there's the, we might be thinking about the Reproduction Act, for example, but there's also the Making Available right if we're talking about Europe, and there are a stacked layer of rights to license here, and that licensing is perpetual. The use is perpetual. So if we think about if we're licensing a content feed, that content at that point in time, but licensing the rights is something that will go on and on and on. And I think maybe delineating between the large language models and the mega companies and the everyday company or user or researcher or creator that is using these AI systems sort of as plumbing in the background. So if we think, did licensing with regard to digital uses of content, was that a flash in the pan? Or are we still doing it? We're still doing it. And Arent.
I mean, maybe just to add 5 seconds to it, I mean, human curiosity doesn't go away. And I think that should fill us all with hope.
Fair. And with that, I would like to thank our panel and our audience and just remind everybody that licensing provides compliant access to high-quality copyrighted works, which leads to innovative uses. Licensing has consistently, just to your point, provided an outlet for innovation and respect for copyright. From the invention of the photocopier, wow, is that old information, to the introduction of the World Wide Web, and is now poised and is actually doing this licensing today for AI. Responsible AI starts with licensing. And that is, I hope, what you will take away from this panel discussion today. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And we're going to hang around for questions if anybody has any for the next couple of minutes. Thank you so much.